we often take the love that belongs to God alone and give it to someone or something else.
Welcome to this episode of The French Press. Let me pour you a cup of coffee while we talk about intrigues of faith, pages we've dog-eared, and the life in between on The French Press.
Hi, welcome back to The French Press, where we talk about books I've read, intrigues of faith, and the life in between. Please join me in cups of conversation as we explore these books I've been looking at. I have them all fanned out in front of me. I have several I'm going to pull from for this episode. If you're new here, I talk about books I'm reading. I like to read 8 or 9 at a time, the Bible being the main one, and I kind of weave them all together and different kind of applications towards our faith or life. And if you're a reader, a lot of you have actually purchased the books I've talked about, and a lot of you keep asking me for a list of the books, which I have posted. So if you follow me on social media or Instagram, well, if you don't, you should. So follow me there and you will see the books. I often post about them, talk about them, so you can see which ones I've talked about in the past or I'm talking about right now. And several of you have bought them and told me you've bought them. And I've even said, hey, if you are borrowing or buying these books and reading them, send me a picture of it. And I've posted a few of those. So I get really excited when people buy the books. Sorry, that is Scout yawning so loudly. He is bored with this introduction. I'm going to try to hurry it up. But if you're not a reader, and other of you have told me, oh, I like listening to the podcast, but I'm probably not going to read these books. And I feel like people kind of say it like sort of with chagrin, but that's great too. I think this is a great podcast for people who don't have time to read, but they're interested in the stories. And you might be like, I'll never get these books and read them, but I actually really like to hear about them. So wherever you fall on the spectrum of you're going to buy the book and read it, or you'll never read this book, but you enjoy listening to the podcast, I'm so glad you're here for all of this. I am going to start by introducing a new book. It perhaps has the most boring title of any book I've ever talked about thus far. It is called Child Training Tips by Reb Bradley. And the subtitle, which is a little more informative, is What I Wish I Knew When My Children Were Young. And this is an older book, as a lot of the books I'm reading are, and he's basically giving you some parenting tips. Now, this is definitely not a podcast about parenting, so I am not going to talk about that. So if you want to get this book and read it as a parent and use it as a parenting tip, you should do that. That would be great. I'm not going to talk about it in that way, though. I am going to talk about it in the sense of us being God's children and how God works on us and what the goals of the Holy Spirit and the Bible and the fruit of the Spirit, like what are we trying to achieve with all that? What is God trying to achieve in his children, which is us? I actually have read this book with a group, and then I told a lot of people about this book. So I've actually had lots of conversations about this book. It is very offensive, I think is the word. It really kind of challenges you, obviously in your parenting, but more so it challenges you as a Christian and kind of where you're at in your walk and kind of what the goals are here. And we all felt, I don't know what the word is, kind of put off by the book. And I had a hard time even sharing with people. And I really struggled with, I would even talk about it on this podcast because it just kind of had that feeling to it. But what I found is I would talk to people about it and I'd be like, here's what's really hard. Here's what's challenging. And people would be like, yep, that sounds terrible. And we'd move on with our lives. And then they would call me later or text me later and be like, what was the name of that book you were talking about? So I think it's one of those books that you kind of don't want to read, but maybe you do. So I'm going to give it that kind of overview. It is very challenging. And just as another side note, I'm reading a lot of different books here. If you've been listening, you know I pick up a lot of them in the free library, or maybe they're book I'm doing in a study or something. And so I'm not just talking about books that I 100% agree with. I actually would have 0 books to talk about except the Bible. But even the Bible challenges me as it does. So I am not suggesting books and saying, oh, read this book. Everything this person says is perfect and amazing. I'm more saying read this book, get out of it what you want. There's going to be parts that are going to challenge you and you may have to have some discernment with or a grain of salt with. And that's true of all these books, even the classics, even the novels. I'm like, oh, I don't like the way they do this. And certainly the teaching books. So, okay, that said, the book literally in the beginning tells you to not get offended by it. Like he kind of like starts it out saying, don't get offended by this book. And I think I can speak for all of us. We are then all immediately offended. And we're kind of like, well, we'll see how we feel about this book. But I'm talking about it because at the end of the day, I mostly liked it. Maybe I all liked it. I don't know. And one of the goals he talks about this is with child training, but again, I'm going to take it to training ourselves, because as we were reading these books, even though we're reading them as parents, maybe really what you're encountered with is, oh, I don't even do these things that maybe I want my child to do, or I'm asking a child to do, or, maybe you're a teacher or you work in ministry with children, or you have nieces and nephews, just anybody who has children in their lives. You're going to think like, well, I want them to be this way. I want to train them this way. And yet, are we trained in that way? And that was what made me want to read the book. That was more my motivation in reading it. So he talks about what is the goal of child training. And again, what is the goal of just ourselves, training ourselves to do anything? What's the goal? And he kind of breaks it down into 3 elements. And I thought these were really good. I thought they were really interesting. And I really reference them often since I've read this book. The first one is self-control. Not being ruled by passions, emotions, desires, wishes, or curiosities. And that word desire is going to come up in several of the books I'm reading right now. So we're going to kind of hang on to that word. And then he says it's the freedom from having to do what one feels like doing. And I thought that was a really interesting explanation of self-control. I tend to think of self-control as sort of like binding you up, right? Like tying your hands up and don't do these things and don't do these things and have control and don't eat that cake and don't yell and don't, whatever it is. But he's really presenting it as a form of freedom, that you don't have to give in to your anger or your depression or your laziness or your, whatever it is you're kind of struggling with. We don't have to give in to these feelings. We can actually have self-control. And self-control is one of the fruits of the spirits, right? I pray about the fruits of the spirits a lot. That is often in my prayers. I'm asking the Lord for the fruits in my life, in the life of my family, in the life of the people I'm discipling or ministering to or mentoring. I'm always praying for the fruits. And of course, we all want love, joy, and peace. Like, yes, Lord, an abundance of those. But then as you kind of work your way down the list and you get down to like patience and self-control and long suffering, like, well, maybe less of those. I don't know if I'm really all that interested in those fruits. Yet they're all in there, right? The fruit of self-control is very valuable, so valuable that God put it in the fruits of the Spirit. Like, this is a freedom. There's a freedom from eating from this fruit. And so having one of the goals in your life to become mature is that ability to have self-control. And ultimately, he says it fosters the selflessness necessary for love of others. And you'll find in this book, as we kind of work through it, that he's getting down to the last chapter, which is really about your children or you, those you're ministering to, being able to love others, being able to have that selfless love and going through the steps of maturity to get you there. Because none of us in our immaturity can love others well. None of us can. We have a hard time loving those that love us back and treat us well, let alone those who we maybe struggle with or they wrong us or we suffer with. Scout is very upset about this, as you can hear. He does not care for loving others. He is very selfish and he does not want to hear any of this. So I understand you might feel like Scout and you kind of want to bark at this. The next one is wisdom, which is understanding, insight, and learning from experience to be able to make sound decisions. Another one I pray for all the time. Lord, give me wisdom. I don't have the wisdom. The word says to pray for this, to ask for this. I don't want to use human wisdom. I don't want to use my own wisdom. I want to use his wisdom. And so I'm praying for that a lot. That's another sign of maturity, is having wisdom. And then the last one is responsibility, accepting personal accountability for one's own actions. And of course, it's so easy to see this in children or dogs per se. They don't take responsibility. Yet this is something that we need to do and kind of work through so we're not ruled by our own passions. So I really liked his definition of what is maturity. And he goes through and kind of gives you these checklists of like, this is what an indulged person looks like. This is what a coddled person looks like. I mean, he's saying children, but these are what these things look like. And when you work through these lists, I think I was surprised, and I think almost everyone I talked to who read this book, you're surprised how much you show up in these lists of, oh, I am really selfish in that way, and I wouldn't have thought of it that way. So it's a really interesting book to sort of do a self-evaluation on. I found myself quite lacking, and it's an interesting book to do that with. But he is ultimately working his way down to this last chapter, which was my favorite chapter, where he talks about teaching your children to love others. That was interesting to me as the final goal. I don't know that I think of that even in myself is my final goal in maturity in all this, to be able to love others. Obviously, it's to be able to love God first and foremost, but then the next commandment is to love others. And he's kind of like, you got to work through these things to be able to do that. You got to work through maturity. And here's things that you might be giving into immaturity or selfishness without even realizing it, and looking for love ultimately to be your highest virtue, love of others. And you have to define love. We're defining it in a biblical way. What is love? Jesus loved us so much that he laid his life down for us, that he was willing to die for us while we were still sinners. Are we willing to love someone even though they hurt us, even though they reject us? We look at the lives of the disciples and how they would preach truth to people, and they would end up stoned, and they would end up in jail, and they would end up hated. And yet they love these people so much that they actually could count it joy. That can only be done, I think, through supernatural powers, that they could count it joy to suffer for the gospel. And are we able to get to this point? I actually read this last chapter, and I would reread this last chapter. Should reread it right now. I read this chapter in the parking lot one day, and it was kind of moving me to tears, which won't surprise anyone because I cry a lot, but it was very moving. And right afterwards, there was a little altercation in the parking lot, and I thought, oh, I was really set up for this because I could have been really offended and upset. And instead, I was like, okay, this thing that's happening is coming out of brokenness, and let me just pray over this situation. Let me pray over what's really happening. And is this on my radar so I can pray for someone who is maybe difficult to love, someone who's a little tricky? I could see the fruit of it immediately, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. Like, I read this chapter, I was immediately challenged, like minutes afterwards, and was able to be like, okay, I'm going to pray about this instead, and I'm going to love this person instead of being angry at this person. And I thought that was interesting. Just that was noteworthy in my mind that there was such immediate fruit from it. There's a lot of Bible verse references in this. This is a Christian book. I think that's been obvious. But one is from 1 Timothy 5:8, and he's saying, love is proven not by how we treat the needy, but how we treat our own families. So that's a big one. How are we treating those around us? They're often the hardest to love, right? Because we live life with them, and they're in our lives, and they annoy us, and they're difficult, and our kids and our husbands and our wives and our families and the people we're with a lot can be the hardest to love. And it's really easy to kind of like pull away from that and be like, well, I like my friends better, but you don't really live life with your friends the way you do with your family. So I think that's an interesting verse. But then also John 14:15, Matthew 5:46 through 47, love is proven not by how we treat our friends, but how we treat those who oppose us. There's a definition of love for you. How do we treat those who oppose us? It's in many ways easy to love our friends and family, even though they're difficult and they're annoying and they're hard. We know they love us. And I know that's not true for everybody. I'm speaking in broad senses here, but how do we treat those who oppose us, those who are against us? And again, love defined in a biblical way of loving someone who's difficult. And what does love look like? And what is the definition of love? And I challenge you to look at that biblically and understand what that looks like. We, as parents, or, if you work with children, you don't love them by saying, oh, you're doing something dangerous and something that's going to really hurt your character, and so I'm going to let you do that. We instead say, well, I'm going to give you a consequence for that because I don't want you to fall into the trap of thinking this is okay, this behavior is okay, or thinking that doing something dangerous is fine because you enjoy it. So it's that God disciplines us, right? The Bible tells us that He chastens those He loves, just like a good father, a good parent chastens his son, because we want them to live in like God's will, right? We don't want them just left and right and all over the place. We want them down the narrow path that God has set for us, and the rules and the commandments and all these things are because He loves us. He is a good God and He loves us. And even though we're flawed parents, if we're good parents or good teachers or good Sunday school teachers, we do these things because we love them. We want to teach them to have good character. I was recently reminded of the fairy tale Cinderella. We're all familiar with sort of the Disney version of it, right? Cinderella gets the makeover scene, and the Prince Charming, he meets her at the ball and she's so beautiful and lovely, and then he's trying to find her again, which is sort of the Disney version. But the actual version, I'm assuming it's German, but I don't know, sorry if it's not, is that because she was forced to do so much work, where her stepsisters apparently were kind of lazy and did whatever, and she was forced to do all the chores and do all the work, she had built up really good character. And so when the prince met her, he was attracted to her character. And we don't really, that kind of gets lost in our modern Cinderella story. But I thought that was interesting, that disciplining someone or giving consequences or giving chores, giving responsibilities, these things all move towards maturity and being able to self-govern. And that is very attractive. I mean, we feel safer with someone who can self-govern versus someone who kind of flies off the handle or makes bad decisions. We don't feel as safe with that type of person. So to be a mature Christian is someone who is in control of their emotions and in control of their actions and has laid them down before the Lord because they love the Lord and they love others and are willing to sacrifice their own desires for what God desires. And that brings me into the next book, which I talked about last time, and I'm going to talk about again. It's called Instruments in the Redeemer's Hands by Paul David Tripp. And a few of you have told me about this book. It's very long and heady, and I'm not very far into it, but I really like it, even though it really challenges me. And I've made lots of marks in it. And he talks about in here kind of what desires are. What does it mean to desire something? He says that God made us with a desire in our heart. And the best thing is to desire God and to desire His ways and be willing to die to what the world offers or what we want, and how desires get twisted so easily and quickly. And we ourselves fall into the wrong desires, desiring the wrong things. And that ultimately we have to keep in check, what are we desiring, and not let that just take off and be its own thing. And I thought what was interesting, what it tied in well with, was in Acts. This is where I am in the Bible. In Acts 3, this is where Peter and John, they go to the temple during the hour of prayer, and a certain man was lame from his mother's womb, and he would carry his mat daily to the temple, and he would ask for alms, and he's like a poor beggar person. And he sees Peter and John and fastens his eyes upon him and is basically begging, asking for something. And then Peter says to him, "Gold and silver have I none, but such as I have give I thee. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk." And he took him by the right hand and lifted him up. And immediately his feet and ankle bone received strength. And he leaped up, stood, walked, and entered with them into the temple, walking and leaping and praising God. And all the people saw him walking and praising God. And they knew who it was. You know, they're kind of like, oh, we know who this guy is. He couldn't walk before, and now he was. They're all wondering, like, what happened here? How did this guy get healed? And Peter answers them and says, "Why do you marvel at this? Why do you look earnestly on us, as though we in our own power or our own holiness made this man to walk? But it was the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and the God of our fathers has glorified his son Jesus, whom you delivered up and denied him in the presence of Pilate. And when he was determined to let him go, but you denied the Holy One and the just, and desired a murderer to be granted unto you, and killed the Prince of Life, whom God has raised up from the dead, whereof we are witnesses. In his name has made this man strong, whom you see and know. Yea, the faith which is by him has given him this perfect soundness in the presence of you all." And I think this story goes along so well with Peter is saying to this man, I don't have worldly things to offer you. I can't give you gold and silver. And you could replace gold and silver with a lot of things, right? I can't give you employment, or I can't give you the family you want, or I can't give you your dreams. And, I can't give you these things, but I can give you this truth, the words of eternal life, which we talked about in previous podcasts, where he's offering eternal life through his word, through the word of God. And in this story, it's illustrated by him being healed. But God is always working on healing us. When we cry out to him, he's working on healing us. And a lot of times it's interior work. It isn't like your, ankle bone is made straight and you can walk. That happens. That would be great. But it is more the internal stuff. And I think it's really those desires of our heart. God is always working on our hearts. And you can't see it. And it's not something someone could look at you physically and say, oh, they had some healing, like they could this man. But when they talk with you, when you interact with them, you can tell, especially if you knew someone before. If you knew someone and they were a certain way, and then they've been in the word, they've been praying, they've been in church, they've been in a community, and they've started to have some of that heart healing, you can tell. You can tell by the way they talk. You can tell by the way they act. You can tell by their priorities, which I think is interesting. What are they prioritizing in their life? Are they prioritizing their relationship with God and spending time with him and telling people about him? Or are they prioritizing the gold and silver? Are they chasing the dreams and chasing, maybe it's money, maybe it's power, maybe it's a lifestyle, maybe it's sports, maybe it's accolades, whatever it is. It can be a lot of things, but are they chasing after that gold and silver still? And yes, we need money to live. We need to have jobs. It is absolutely fine to be in sports and hobbies. These are all fine things. But if that's what we're chasing, if that's our heart's desire, then it becomes a problem, right? But if our desire is God, and it can only, I believe it can only be that way if we let the Holy Spirit work on us. And I think back on some of those verses, like, create in me a clean heart, oh God. That has been in my prayers lately a lot. Like, God, give me a clean heart. Clean out all that sin and all that darkness, all that gold and silver, those things that I think I want or I think I need, that I've turned into desires, when instead I should just be desiring you. And when you meet these people that have been healed in their heart, in their mind, however you want to think of it, something happened. Something happened in their lives. Like, they were this and now they're this way. And maybe that's true for you. Maybe you used to think and act a different way, and now you're working on changing. And it's a lifelong process. We never get there. But have you let God have the desires of your heart? Is he the desire of your heart? Which is kind of what he's asking us in the instrument in the Redeemer's hand. And the subtitle on this book is People in Need of Change, Helping People in Need of Change. And I didn't fully realize that when I started reading this book, because I was like, wow, he's talking a lot about just how we as broken people work on getting healed through Christ and then help other people. And it's like, oh, this is such a strong theme. And I didn't understand that's really what the whole book's about. So he's really talking about getting our desires right, which should be for God and then to help other people. And so the parenting book goes along so well with it. Are we maturing the way we should be? Can you run through these checklists he puts in there and say, oh yeah, okay, I don't do that. Or wait, I really struggle in this area. I need to work on that and work on changing the desires of your heart. Ultimately, I think the heart is the target for God, right? That's what he's trying to work on, or that he is working on if we let him. He says in here that we should be ruled by worship and service. These should be the things of our heart. Can we worship God in this activity, in this conversation, in this calling? I mean, in most cases, yes, there is a way to worship God through it. And am I serving others in it? In most cases, there is that option. You know, I think of a sports team. Do you have good sportsmanship? Are you an ugly winner or an ugly loser? You know, like how could you worship and serve God through your ability to play a sport? Or it could be the same in maybe you have a crafting group you do different things with. And, you know, what is your conversation like? Are there opportunities to bring something up that has a deeper meaning or a little more spiritual meaning? Or do you back off from that because you're afraid? In these different groups and social groups we're in, what is the conversation like? How are people behaving? Do you go along with it? Do you kind of, you know, rub up against it and be like, well, maybe we shouldn't talk that way? Or maybe this person's hurting and that's why they're like that. Are we pointing people towards loving others? And he talks about how we often take the love that belongs to God alone and give it to someone or something else. You know, and what are we putting before God? It says, an idol in the heart creates a stumbling block before the face. Until the idol is removed, it will distort and obscure everything else in the person's life. So again, it just goes back to those desires. This is out of Isaiah 29:13. The focus of God's transforming grace is heart change. Our spiritual battle is a war from the heart. When the war is won, people behave in ways that please their Creator. God will never be satisfied with the crumbs. He rails against this in Isaiah. These people come near to me with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far off. So what do we have our hearts set on? He's saying that everyone seeks some kind of treasure. What are we seeking? We are made to desire. God made us to desire something, and we often will fill it with other things instead of God, instead of love of his word, love of spending time with him, love of serving others. What do we have our hearts set on? The things that we set our hearts on never remain under our control. Instead, they capture, control, and enslave us. This is the danger of an earth-bound treasure. In Hans Brinker, I'm still reading this book, still making my way through it. There's a scene where the boys are staying at an inn and they get robbed during the night. And they had all been very boastful before about how they weren't afraid of anything and they could take anybody, and then they get robbed in the night, and some of them do react in bravery and boldness and some of them do not. And she kind of talks about in the book of like how this is what was really in their hearts, right? We can all say that whatever, but when it really comes down to it, you know, what's in our heart? How are we going to behave in these difficult situations? And this is sort of what he talks about instrument in the Redeemer's hands, about how we like to blame our situations on how we behave. I certainly like to do this, like, oh, this person annoyed me, or I was tired that day, or I was having a bad week and so I lashed out, or that guy cut me off in traffic so I, you know, let myself get really angry. We, I think, all like to say like situations cause us to behave a certain way, and he really goes against that in the book, saying actually whatever's in your heart will come out in these difficult situations. So if something ugly is coming out, it was probably in there, or it was in there, and now it's getting jostled and it's spilling over. And that's good to be aware of, because that's something you need to work on. And I thought that kind of illustrated that well in the Hans Brinker. And even in several of the characters, it's like when they get rocked a little bit or someone pushes back on them, they behave in ugly ways, or some of them have compassion and are kind to like Hans and his sister, and others of them mock them and tease them for being poor and having a father who has an illness. And we see this all the time, right? How do we respond to situations? And really, that is just proving what's in our hearts. And if that ugliness comes out, it's a good indicator, right? Like, ooh, I don't like how I behaved in that situation. I don't like how I acted when that person said that. Or I don't like how I acted when my kids did this. Or this person at work is really able to rile me up. Well, why is that? And chances are there's like a wound in our hearts that we need the Lord to heal, and it's kind of poking that wound. Or we have some really ugly thoughts and perspectives where we're not loving God and we're not loving people. And so then when we're put in these situations, we respond in a certain way, fear being the same, right? Like God tells us not to fear, and yet we react to situations in fear. So it's something to examine. Why does this thing make me so fearful? Why am I afraid of the dark? Why am I afraid of different things happening? Is it because that is in my heart? Like I'm actually dealing with fear and not giving them to God, or I'm dealing with anger. Why do I get angry so often? Why am I annoyed so often? And so I thought she does that well in the book, of having these kids kind of rub up against issues, and then the way they all respond is different. Wow, Scout is barking a lot today. This is the most he's barked in any episode. You guys tell me you love it when he barks, so hopefully you still do. Maybe after this episode, you'll change your mind. His barking is definitely rubbing up against something in my heart, and I want him to just be quiet, but I suppose I have to love Scout too. So I'm going to finish up with one of the little devotions out of that Starting Today book, which I think is the most popular book that I've done. I'm going to shut this door. And I think I heard someone drive up outside, and Scout cannot have that. That is not allowed. We must bark. I'm going to talk about a couple of these devotions from the Starting Today. I'm almost done with this book, and I'm actually really, really sad about it. I'm really drawing it out. I think I only have a few more devotions left. And this is, I think, the book the most of you have bought. So that's great. I really have liked it. This one, it's called Hunger Pains. And it tells this story about a man who goes and buys a bird as a pet, and he has it in a cage, and it doesn't seem to be thriving. Like it's not doing well. So he goes back to the pet shop and is saying like, my parrot is just not doing well. Maybe it's a bird. And the guy will be like, oh, well, you know, birds like to swing. Did you get it a swing? And the guy gets it a swing and brings it home, and he's still just not doing well. And he's like, oh, well, birds like to look at themselves in a mirror. So maybe you should get it a mirror and it can look at itself. They love to do that. And this kind of goes on, and he's going back and forth between this pet shop and buying all these things for the bird. Ultimately, he dies. So as a parrot, so this parrot dies, and right before he dies, he says to the person, finally, he says, don't they sell any bird seed at the pet store? So like, obviously the idea is that he forgot to feed the bird. Like he gave him everything else, all the toys, all the things, but he never actually fed the bird. And I thought this was a really interesting analogy. It says, some of us have mistakenly thought that happiness consists of lining our cages with toys, gadgets, and other stuff. Excessive consumption has become the hallmark of American life. But there's a spiritual hunger in the human heart that can't be satisfied by seeing one's own image reflected back in vanity mirrors, playing with our grown-up toys, or climbing the corporate ladder. Our hearts need real nourishment. The love of family and friends, relationships over the pursuit of more things, personal integrity, a secure connection to God. These are the things that feed the soul. And I think that really goes along with what we're talking about. What are we chasing? What is in our heart? What are our desires? Is it to love people? Is it to spend time with God? Are these the things we want? And we're told, you know, God tells us we need him. We talked about abiding a couple episodes ago, that we need to abide with the Lord. He is the one that nourishes us and feeds us spiritually. And if we're not in the Word, if we're not having community with other believers, spending time in worship, spending time in prayer, and I would go on to say even spending time in ministry and serving others, we really need these things to nourish our souls. And we get tricked into chasing the gold and silver. And Peter said, I don't have gold and silver. These aren't the things I carry about with me. What I have, though, are the words of eternity, are healing words. And in the Instruments book, he talks often about how we are counselors. We are determining life through the lens of people around us. People counsel us all the time, even if they don't mean to. And we counsel people with our words and our actions. We are influencing other people around us. Are we doing it well? Is the desire to point them towards God? Is the desire to say, the way I talk to you, the way I treat you, the way I behave is going to point you towards God? Or is it about my gold and silver? Whatever that might look like. I'm going to end in this last one. This is another one from starting today. This is called Olympic Glory. And it's about two athletes that were going to compete in the Olympics, which is very timely. I know those are coming up. And apparently these two women were best friends and they were going to compete in the Olympics together. This was in 2000. And one of them ends up hurting her knee and can't compete, but she was the better one. Like she was going to win, but then she hurts her knee. So then the other girl's going to win instead. And she forfeits because she says, this wouldn't have been a fair fight. So I'm going to forfeit. You actually deserve it, but you got hurt. And so she ends up winning these awards through the Olympics for being a good citizen. And she kind of goes and travels with the Olympics and talks about this. I had no idea, never heard of this. I thought that was kind of interesting. But he pulls out this part about this other girl was winning a personal battle over ego and selfishness, because apparently she had been struggling with that. There had been stories of her cheating and taking unfair advantages. Apparently, he's saying she kind of had this battle with that, and then she ultimately gave it up for her friend. And he said, Paul wrote about giving up certain rights for the sake of people who we love. Parents do this all the time for their children, and occasionally friends make these gestures like this woman. And like, how often do we do this? We do give up a lot of things we would love to do, but instead we're parenting, or, we're in a family unit and we can't just be all about ourselves, or we're on a team at work or on a sports team and, we want to get all the glory, but it makes more sense if we're, maybe down at the base working on more of the fundamentals, or we're working on some project and we don't really get the glory. We don't get our name on the book, or we don't get to take the award home, even though we helped with that. And how often are we willing to let other people have that glory? And how does that work on our character? How do we fight our ego and fight our our selfishness by giving up things that maybe we deserve, maybe we don't? And I thought that was a good way to think of it, to kind of bring this all together of what are the desires of our heart? Are we working towards maturity? What is maturity? How do we let God heal us? Are we in relationship with him? Are we putting time in so we are getting that healing, so we can be what he wants us to be, which are instruments in God's hands? So thank you for joining me today in this cup of conversation. Again, let me know if you buy the books. I love to hear it. Please follow me on social media. I love to hear what you guys are getting out of this. And thank you for all of you that follow and comment, and especially if you share it with other people. That's maybe the ultimate goal, is that, it would mean something to you and you would share it. And thank you for those of you that tell me you do. So Scout has been the most vocal ever, and he is also signing off, and we look forward to next time. I'm so glad you joined me today on the French Press. If you liked what you heard, you should follow me. That way you'll get all the latest episodes. And if you wouldn't mind taking a minute to rate the show. Also, if you'd like to follow my blog, The Demi-Tasse Drafts, I have a link below in the show notes. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Anytime you can leave a like, comment, reshare a post. All these help my ministry get more traction. The most important thing you can do is pray. I really appreciate all of your support. Thank you for sharing a French press with me today.